Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming by for our latest installment of our Inservice. Today we have the pleasure to welcome Ms. Tony Kelly Campbell from School District 1. She is the director of the social work department there. And Ms. Kelly Campbell comes with a lot of experiences where she's been at School District 1 for over 10 years as a director. She has a lot of history of working with women and children from DHEC, and she is a master's from USC in social work. So without any further ado, Ms. Tony Kelly Campbell.
Well, thank you. Thanks. Thanks for inviting me in. Anytime I have an opportunity to talk about what we do in the school district, particularly Richland 1, it's really exciting for me because I feel like Richland 1 probably offers more to its students than certainly any of the surrounding districts. We have a very strong support team. So as I was asked today to come and talk about school social work services, one of the things that I think is imperative that I do is to let you know that we really work as part of a system. The school social worker is part of the overall team of support services in a school. I do want to start out by saying I hope that if you have questions that you stop me at that point and I'll answer the questions, because it's a small group and we can get some give and take and keep you guys going and stay on track for you all for the next hour. As I get started, I do want to point out there's a core support team in just about every school in our district. And that core team is certainly the school guidance counselor, the school psychologist, the school nurse, and the school social worker. Now, in some schools, you may have other people that come in and out of that team. There may be a parent educator in some schools. In other schools, there may be a parent and community involvement person. But those first four, those are people that you're going to see in all of the schools in Richland School District 1. And I think, as I said, if you compare that to what's offered around the state, we should really realize that in this county and school district, we're very fortunate to have those people to work with our students, because one of the things that we know is that our students come to us with lots and lots of baggage, lots and lots of issues and challenges that they are facing that we can't even begin to get to the classroom until we begin to deal with some of those issues. So as I begin, I do want to kind of give you an overview of what each one of those people offer to the team, and then I'll go into talking a bit about school social work, and then I'll try and answer a couple of the questions. I was given 3 questions that I was told that I needed to make sure that I channeled in on as I spoke to you all today. But as I said, this is an informal group, so please, feel free to stop me at any point, and I will, answer those questions for you. When we talk about guidance and counseling in our schools, we also have a great ratio of guidance and counselors. What our guidance people do is they have a 4-point guidance program in our school, and one of the things they do as guidance counselors is individual work. And that individual work is what you're really going to see with a guidance counselor when they're doing the traditional things you think of as a guidance counselor. They go into each and every classroom in the school and they provide just some basic information on problem solving, conflict resolution, anger management. It's for students that really don't have problems, but to make them aware. So it's sort of an educational process, an awareness process. It's not a therapeutic sort of thing. So that's what our guidance counselors do on the individual level in terms of working with students. Another thing they do is they provide a guidance curriculum to all of the students. So that goes to each and every student. And I'll back up and say with the individual work that we do, that's when a guidance counselor might sit down with a student, and that guidance counselor is doing what we call maybe that academic plan for that student, what courses that student might want to take, and as the student gets older, what schools that student may want to go to, from high schools even into, because we do have some specialized high schools in our district, some that work with some of the Midlands Tech College, as well as, trying to think of another one, we have an evening high school, and we have an Olympia Learning Center, which is an alternative school, but sometimes that's the right choice for some of our students based on what's going on. So a guidance counselor might sit down with a student and family and begin to plan those things out. They might also begin to talk with them with their individual sessions around careers, around exposure to careers, around taking those students out to different job sites as a group and saying, this is what an engineer does every day. But those are things that, as you think about guidance, that they can do. The other thing they do is something called responsive services. Those are those typical things that you may see on an afternoon special where a student is pregnant or a student comes in and is talking about being very depressed or suicidal or something like that. Those are those things that need to happen right away. with the student. So a guidance counselor, they do what they call responsive services. And then the final thing that the guidance counselors do is they do just basic system support, things that are needed to maintain that guidance department and things that may be needed to maintain a guidance department within a school. They may do staff development for the staff around that school to show them how to deal with certain behaviors that they see with their students, or to make them aware of developmental issues that are going on with students. If you're an elementary school teacher, you may not have had a lot of work around how to work with students that are beginning prepubescent children. So they may go in and do something around that. They may go in and do something with teachers on how to handle just certain very low-level types of behavior problems with students. So they do that kind of thing. Your school psychologist, one of the myths I'd like to dispel right now is school psychologists, at least in our district and in the surrounding districts, do very little counseling. People tend to see psychologists and, you know, they want to send students to get therapy from the school psychologist. That is not the role of the school psychologist, at least in the state of South Carolina and in our district. In our district, what your school psychologist is primarily going to be involved in is screening students to determine if those students need special services, and also going in, doing observations of students in the classroom to see whether or not the student's behavior is outside of the norm, to see if they see what the teacher is seeing, to see if that student is exhibiting something that is just not in that normal range. So that is what you'll find your school psychologist doing. The other things the school psychologists spend a significant amount of time doing is testing. They do a lot of testing and a lot of evaluation of students. So what will typically happen is a student would be referred in for seeing the team of people that I spoke about. And on that team, they try several interventions before they would even get to the school psychologist. The school psychologist would probably be involved with helping to develop a behavioral plan, because you can have a behavioral plan on a student and the student does not need to be special education. That student could just be a student that the parent has identified as having lots of behavior problems at home. The school is seeing the same thing. The school psychologist will typically go in, watch that student at a couple different times during the day. They'll look to see if it's the morning time. They'll assess to find out if it's the afternoon, after lunch. Is the student getting tired or cranky? They'll look at a lot of different things and they'll do an observation with that student. And finally, once the school psychologist gets to the point where they actually have tested a child and they've made a recommendation, either the child is going to be recommended for special education or not, then the school psychologist would really help to develop that IEP with the team. So the school psychologist's role is more testing and evaluation than anything else. And of course, the writing of BIPs for children. The nurse. The school nurse really is in charge of, in your school, just pretty much managing all health issues, and there are lots of things that come along with students that have health issues that impact their behavior. So if you have a guardian who is working with a child with a health issue, you may see some behavior problems on things that you would never dream. There's some asthma medication that causes behavior problems, and you'll get reports that this child has a behavior problem, and it may just be the medication. So that's why we feel like having all of these people involved, they all bring something to the table in terms of a perspective that we need to be aware of as we're working with students. School nurses are not just responsible for giving out medication. I always like to tell people what they do is, if you have students that are on various types of medications that may impact their behavior, they may do some education with that patient, with that student, as well as that student's parents, because a lot of times our parents will leave the doctor's office and they'll not have good information, or they'll not have asked on how different medications will impact students. So the school nurse spends quite a bit of time coordinating things with a doctor's office. So if you've got a child that is on medication and things are just kind of screwy at school and you're not quite sure what's going on, it's a good idea to talk to the school nurse, because that nurse can give you some insight in terms of how that medication might be impacting what you see with the student. And there are times even when we have, yes, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Because at the time that I retired, in 2004, you couldn't get the information. You didn't know the child was taking the medication. And it would have an impact on them, because sometimes those medications get split. Kid goes completely off, and you don't even know they're taking medicine. and they tell me you're not supposed to tell anyone. I mean, the school nurse can't tell you that.
There's something called HIPAA, which is the Health Information Portability Act. And basically what that says is that unless you have permission, you can't give out information. If you're working with a student, however, and all that needs to happen is the parent just needs to sign a release of information. And also, if you're working with a student, go ahead.
Excuse me. Our appointment order that we give to our volunteers is a court order designating these volunteers as such a guardian that they could receive information. Would the school district respect that court order?
If it's very specific and it says that they should have rights to the academic and health,
And it does.
okay, then I would imagine that it would. I know on court orders, if it says academic records and not just directory information, we do honor that. HIPAA, they may ask you to do an additional form, but it shouldn't be. I would think if they put in there all health records and date it, you would be fine. But I can take that back to our legal department, but I'm pretty sure they will honor that.
So what's going to happen initially, these kids are actually in custody of DSS.
Right.
So it necessarily would necessitate us getting a signature from DSS worker to get access to records and documents that our appointment order for our volunteers do so, or is
The way it works is if DSS has terminated parental rights, then we can give any information to DSS, any information.
a lot of these cases have not reached the
But
point
if
of-
it hasn't reached that point, but DSS has gotten educational or rights for the child, because they don't always have it. You know, if they have gotten educational rights, then we're okay on giving that. But if they don't have it, and that's the question that has to be asked, because sometimes it's just a case that a caseworker may be managing and they don't have all the rights. So and special ed is very, very specific with wanting to make sure that the educational rights have actually been turned over to an agency before they will then allow another party to get information.
So some of the kids are not in special ed.
Right, I'm just saying special ed is even more stringent than regular ed.
Oh,
Okay, now regular ed, what I would say to that is, you know, if it says health and academic records and it's a court order, then I don't see the problem. You know, I would not have a problem turning those over to you though.
But if you can't get them, then what do you do? Maybe you have to-
If you,
Contact the CASA supervisor, and we'll make sure I can do liaison with DSS, so we'll make sure that it's good. My next question would be, as a rule of thumb, would be based a good plan to contact the school social worker, guidance counselor up front, let them know who we are, let them see what our appointment order is, let them know what kind of documentation we're looking at trying to gather.
I would say the guidance counselor is probably your best point. But if you know you want to look at the health records, talk to the school nurse. But the guidance counselor, either one of those two, if you know that it's mainly academic things that you want to have access to, but if you also know the kid has health issues and is taking medication, the guidance counselor really would probably be the best person, because then they could kind of gather everyone up. Yeah.
I'm not sure if I asked you this question before, the opportunity for some of our volunteers to be invited to some of these core meetings or IEP meetings, and that's are we able to attend those type of meetings?
You would be able to attend an IEP meeting with permission of DSS or the parent, whoever has educational rights. But you do have to have permission. You just can't show up at an IEP. You have to be invited, because there are certain members that by law have to be there, but then the rest can be invited in. And you will be asked to sign also if you attend one of those meetings.
I recently got a case during the summer, and my child has special needs and such, and so I want to go. I wanted to give the teacher a few weeks to get, organized. Who is the person really, the best person to contact at a school when you want to go and observe a child in the classroom and get the information? Who would be your gatekeeper?
I'm going to tell you how schools work.
Okay, that's what I want to know.
Schools work. You need to always let the principal know. Let them know, and then they will direct you. And they'll 9 times out of 10 are going to direct you to the guidance counselor, just because they are there 100% of the time, and there are more than one in many of the schools. But the principal is the building manager, and that's just a good rule of thumb. Let the principal know and just say, who would be most appropriate to talk with. But I would think that they're going to then put you with the guidance counselor. But yeah. Okay. Let's see. I want to talk to you a little bit about now what school social workers do and kind of how we all can work together. School social workers, if you're familiar with social work, you know that social workers do a lot. You know, people will try and ask you to define social work and say exactly what it is, you know, that you guys do. I'm not sure about this. Well, you know, but one of the things I tell people is that the reason why school social work is so broad is because we do work within a system. It's not just tied to being like a school psychologist. They test, they evaluate, they screen, they observe. School social workers may be working with the home, the school, the community, a DSS caseworker, a CASA person, a mentor, and the list goes on and on and on and on. But what we do a lot in our interactions with other agencies and DSS is we do a lot of advocacy work for our students. We may call up and say, hey, we've got X case going on and we need help, resource help. We need help with for food and lights with a family. We've got a case going on where we know that sexual abuse has occurred in the past, and we're scared that this kid is going to be returned to a system or a situation where that may happen. What can we do? Can we sit down and can we begin to put a plan together for this child? Because we all know within Richland School District 1, when I look at the number of cases we get or we send into DSS each year of some type of abuse, it's a lot. And we know a lot of those kids will be returned to their homes. So one of the things we try to do as school social workers is to work on behalf of that student. So to make sure that if we know that DSS is involved, that's actually one of our best things to know with the family, because then we can have some leverage in terms of things that we would like to see happen with students. If we know that DSS is involved and the student may have had a past history of abuse, we'll ask that they go ahead and put in their plan for that student some counseling. We'll ask that they go ahead and make sure that a full medical is done on that student while they have custody of that child. So we'll do a lot of advocacy work when we work with DSS. There are times when we're working with a case with DSS that we'll say, hey, we want to come to the meeting. Before you guys close this case out and as you sit down and do your planning, we want to come over and help do some planning on it. And that's the kinds of things that school social workers will work with. We work with all the other kinds of resource finding, but a lot of times in a school, we're that person that's really going to push for that child to get things. In fact, we had a case this week where it's a 17-year-old boy. He's in high school. He's not going to be 18 until next year. 3.8 grade point average. His parents have totally abandoned him. One is in jail and the other one is in New York. And the question was, where's this child going to be? Who's going to take care of this child? And what we've tried to work out is letting DSS actually get involved, you know, reporting it in. And you know, they don't want to take a 17-year-old, but one of the things that happened this week with him that was really interesting, and you know, it just kind of depends on how you look at it. He got stopped for a speeding ticket and they put him in cuffs. So it was like, oh good, I said, because now DSS will come to his aid. You know, it sounds kind of screwy, but what ended up happening with him is I guess the police decided to take him out of cuffs, but it kind of got some people to start putting some things in place for this student. So it does look like now we have a place for him to live. This is a very smart kid. He's on track team, on the football team. You know, he's got a bright future if we can finish his senior year in school. So we're working with DSS to get some food stamps in place for the kid. The kid does not mind working. In fact, last year he worked 30 hours a week somewhere. And for a high school student, that's pretty tremendous. So we're working this year to put some things in place for him so that he can have some other basic services. Like, we don't know the last time he's had a real physical. You know, he may have had something last year to get on the teams that he was on, but this year we're trying to get him a physical because last year he lived in a friend's basement. So, you know, the things that students come to school with, I tell people, it's not what people think. People think that it's isolated. It's not isolated. It's fairly widespread. And I can go through any one of the school social workers' caseload at any one time and find you case after case of students that really do need someone to come in and advocate and mentor and work in a way as some volunteers do.
How many social workers do you guys have?
In Richland 1 right now we have about 16 social workers.
And they work clusters?
We have them working in different ways. Our social workers are assigned by program as well as there are some general social workers. For instance, we have a special ed social worker who works with the ED population. Those are the students that have severe emotional problems that So she works assigned to nothing but those what we call our high support kids, kids that need lots of intense work, kids that get volatile and can be violent at times. So she works with those programs in the schools. Then we have another social worker that does something called Child Find. That's something that's federally mandated, that they go out and identify students in the community, or children really in the community, that are around age 3 and 4 that have developmental delays. Those are the students that we know, that those kids that you look at sometimes and say something's not quite right, that are in the daycare, on the playground. That's the Child Find program, and she works with nothing but doing observations and being ready to place those students, so that by the time that student comes into public school, we know exactly what kinds of services need to happen for that student: occupational therapy, physical therapy. We have done a psychological on that student and know what type of classroom that child needs to be in. And then we have a social worker that's assigned to our Title I program. And Title I is for kids that are at risk for a number of reasons. Educationally, they're at risk. Academically, they're at risk. And then students that have social issues. So she's assigned to that. That's another federal program that provides lots of money to school districts if they have a high rate of poverty. And we do have a high rate of poverty in Richland 1. I would say our free and reduced lunch is somewhere around 70%, 69–70%. And free and reduced lunch is the indicator that they use to determine whether or not you have a high rate of poverty. And then we have, let's see, those were the 3 specialists. And then we have 13 social workers that are assigned to the remainder of the schools. And we have 48 schools in the district. And typically, school social workers have no more than 3 schools. You know, it just depends. There are a couple of schools right now, because we have a special project going on, and you may have seen it all over the news, called the A+ project, that have 1 social worker per school. And that's because those schools were unsatisfactory, and they have realized that it's more than academic issues going on with the students, that there are many social issues that have to be addressed. So we have them screened out that way. When you talk about the general services that our school social workers provide, like if I am a general school social worker and I go in to provide services, I'm probably going to do a little bit of everything. As a general school social worker, one of the things that people, they tend to think of, oh, you're a school social worker, you work student attendance. Well, that's a piece of what we do. But if you know about attendance, you know what goes along with attendance, because attendance is, you know, and I'll remind you guys, attendance is sort of the gateway, and attendance is a symptom of what's going on in the home. For young children, it may be a symptom of mom having some domestic violence issues in the home, mom just having to work and not getting home until very late and oversleeping, situation where the family may be transient and homeless. It just goes on and on and on. As you get an older child that has student attendance issues, it can be anything from bullying to gang involvement, no longer interested in school, to student maybe being pregnant or parenting a child, because if your child gets sick, you don't have anyone to keep the child that's sick, you've got to stay home with the child, to substance abuse, and the list goes on and on. But school social workers, yeah, in a sense we work attendance, but we just don't say, you know, you're not in school and we need to get you back in school. What we do is we go out and knock on doors, call people, find out why you're not in school, and begin to try to problem solve that situation. So when you see attendance, that's just a piece.
What is a Title I social worker?
The Title I social worker is funded through the Title I program, and she does a little bit of everything.
It's just a general social worker?
No, she can only work through Title I programs. And Title I's focus right now is the very young children and elementary age children at certain schools. And those would be the schools that have a very high rate of poverty. There are some schools in our district that have a very low rate, like the Brennan and maybe Rosewood and a couple of others have a low rate. But then there are some that are like at 98% poverty. And they have identified those 10 maybe priority schools. Each year it could be a little different. They may take 12 one year, 10 another. But they work, and she works in the elementary schools, and they do everything from working with screening those kids that come in to the kindergarten classes and first grade She does a different type of screening to find out where the deficits are with those students, because we know that there's a readiness test that the students take when they come into school, and she'd work with that group of teachers and those parents with those students.
Now, when they have a Title I social worker, will that student have a Title I social worker and another one also? So they just get the Title I?
Just the Title I. Yeah, just the Title I. We, our focus honestly has been on the last couple of years with school social workers, really putting a lot of focus on the middle and high schools, just because we have a lot of services when the students are very young in the district with Title I and some of the other programs that are in some of the schools. So we focused a lot on the middle and high schools, but we do serve our elementary schools also. The types of services that school social workers might refer students to within our system are varied. We have, and I put a brochure in there, the student intervention team, and that is that multidisciplinary group that I mentioned earlier. That's that team actually sitting down and looking at a student front end. And that's actually a pretty good way to, I guess, diagnose what's going on with a student, and to do it in a way that you don't have fragmentation. Every school runs a student intervention team, and some schools do an excellent job. When a student comes in, they make sure that all ends are covered. And that's certainly something that as a CASA volunteer, people could come into and be involved in, make suggestions and give information. We do have mentors that come in sometimes to those meetings. The only time that we would have a problem with that is if the parent said, I just don't want, you you guys in there. But those meetings, that's something that you could come into.
So they do have a right to refuse?
Yeah, parents do.
services?
Yeah, parents do have a right. Yes, they do. Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that a social worker might refer a student to that they're working with is screening. If you're working or you've talked to a school social worker and you've noticed something about a student, the first thing we're going to do, we're not going to jump to refer to special ed. We're going to jump and say, let's do a screening on that kid. Let's get that child in and let them sit before the sit team. We call it the sit team, and see what's going on with that student, because very well there may be some other things that we can add. And as I said, you could have the nurse there. Sometimes we even have the resource officer there at those meetings. So the sit team is very popular, and we do a lot of screenings through that. We've got a lot of services around academic enrichment and academic help for our students. Just every high school has to offer tutoring. That's just the way it is in our district. And there are usually about 3 different types of tutoring going on in any high school. There's athletically funded tutors for those student athletes. We have something called Title V, which is for at-risk students. That's some monies that come in that we offer tutoring through, and then there's some other after-school monies that we have tutoring. So if a student that you're working with, you see the need for it, it's just really a matter of calling in, talking with the guidance counselor, talking with the principal, and getting linked up. And even in our middle and elementary schools, there's the extended day programs, and some of the extended day programs, they have enrichment activities that are less tutorial and more fun for the student after school. And then we have the tutorials for those students that really need additional help. So we've got lots of things. I think one of the things that people don't know, and even parents don't know, all the different services that we have in our school. For those students that you're working with that you feel like there's something wrong with, or even students that you know that are special education, if you don't think that the IEP is good, let us know. Yes?
What would be the criteria for at risk? Is there a standard?
No, not for that.
Cover a large thing?
Yeah, there's no real standard where we have a definition. I almost think all kids have the potential to be at risk. It's just any given day. But special education, if you're familiar with that, it offers an array of services, and it just depends on how well the IEP is written. If the IEP is written to include counseling, it will. If the IEP is written to include a certain amount or type of remediation, those things will occur. But a lot of things can happen for students, and they get a lot of protections under special education. And I would say if you're working with a student and the educational rights are with that DSS worker, or even if you're working with a student and and you have any kind of relationship with a parent, that's the time to really be there, because that's going to be what drives what happens for that student over the next year. And there are lots of things you can ask for. I always say ask, and the worst thing that can happen is that they say no work. But if you have a good justification, there's a lot of different things that special ed might be able to provide for you. If a student.
What about the difference in levels? For example, you have the ED, and there are some kids who are beyond the regular ED. They are really critical. Where do they go?
Those are the students that sometimes what they have is some of the camps that they have. They have different programs around the state that we have students that just do not fit in the classroom, that they cannot be maintained in a school, that we'll send to various places around the state that are educational programs but are more therapeutic in terms of what they provide. They're even a step beyond clinical day, because we did have a clinical day program, and there's still one or two around, and clinical day is where they get at least half of the day some therapeutic type of interaction, and they're in a self-contained environment. But what special ed has to do is they've got to go least restrictive. So the first step, of course, with special ed is putting a child in a resource class, and that's where they just go to that resource teacher maybe 1 period a day or 2 periods a day. And then if it's found that that's not helpful or successful, then that's when they go into a self-contained classroom where they're pretty much with the same teacher all day long. If that doesn't work out, then they start looking at clinical day. And if that doesn't work out, they look at sometimes residential. We do have some students that are in residential, and then also some students have shadows. There are a few that we don't have an awful lot. It just depends on the given year, but some students have shadows that actually will go with them from class to class and sit with them and help to keep them on task and help give them the cues they need to not exhibit certain behavior. So.
Is that a professional person or a volunteer or a mentor or the shadow person?
A shadow has to be paid for, and they usually come from an agency. It's usually like a person, not a home care aide. It's like, but no, it's not a person. It does not require a college degree to be a shadow. They will teach you sort like an instructional assistant type of person.
Is a state employee?
Typically, that we contract to get shadows from different places, but it's not a district employee, because we just never know who's going to need a shadow. But if a shadow is deemed necessary, then we have to have one in place.
I think a lot of times the kids face the stigma of being special ed. Sometimes it impede a lot of their progress because, one, they don't have anybody think that it's special ed. Two, they do things to sabotage the fact, and then all of a sudden they start showing out, the behavior issues starts coming out. And as an advocate, there's always been a kind of a fine line that we have to cross between what do we want to do for our child or advocate for him. The district is saying because of your behavior, because of medication, because of screens, whatever, that you need to be here. But on our sometimes report with that child, we recognize that the child can do better in a probably mainstream setting.
And they can. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that can be stressed with some of our students that we're working with, is that you can work yourself out of special education. And there are some psychologists that are absolutely wonderful with, working with you and working with the student to say, okay, because I think what happens sometimes is the student is accustomed to having been in special ed, and they have to have a reevaluation like every 2 years. So when it's time for the reevaluation, they're already feeling down on themselves, so they just kind of shut down or don't try on the evaluation, so they don't score very well. I've seen some psychologists start off by saying, hey guy, I've looked at your record, ahead of time, and and I think we can probably get you out of special ed. So try your hardest as we work today. If you get tired, let me know, And there are also some strategies too that you can work with your school psychologist with. And I think y'all are in an excellent position to say, hey, I've got permission to talk with the school psychologist. Can we sit down and talk about what the possibility of this is? And it does happen. I've seen it happen. There are some students that are identified early as special ed that may not need to be in special ed, that have worked their way out. It may have been more an environmental deficit, and so that's one of the nice things.
Two cases I had those students. Suddenly they put me into middle school and an elementary school. So I'd had those kids at elementary school, and then I got them again at middle school. And in elementary school, they were in self-contained ED, and they came to me as a class. I was a music teacher. Came to me as a class. And they got in middle school, that opportunity was not there.
Okay.
So they came in with other students. I saw their name on my register, and I kept singing, where is this person? Nobody knew. And one of them would come and eat breakfast and lunch and go home.
Okay.
By the time my class came around, he wasn't there. The other would come, eat breakfast and lunch, and sit in the gym. And everybody said, who is that fellow sitting up there way above the bleachers? When they got into Main Street, they wouldn't go in with the rest of the people.
They're yes.
And see, my class.
I think you know students are, as the older they get, the more they realize, one, that they are different because they get on a different kind of bus, and there are kids that just say they and all the students know who's in special ed because they ride a certain bus, and the older students are, the more they want to be like everybody else, but then we put them on a special bus. So it does present challenges there, and it does not surprise me that some students disappear. But then again, I go back to saying, we're really lucky where we have situations where parents are very involved, but where parents can't be or aren't involved, we do look to the volunteers, we do look to the mentors to say, hey, and most people are pretty receptive. Sometimes you'll have a professional staff that may take affront to being questioned about what they know to be right, but we have to realize, and one of the things that I constantly tell myself is I work to serve the social workers I work for, and I work to serve the students and families. So if they're not happy and they're not coming to school and they're not successful, that's a reflection, and that's what I tell the staff. And I've got pretty good results. I've got some staff that will go to the ends of the earth for their students, and I think that that's what I see you guys doing, questioning, saying, hey, I've been working with this child, I want you to reevaluate. We're going to ask for a reevaluation because we see X, Y, and Z, and we're just not seeing it the way. Or can we try something different? They're in self-contained. Can we try doing resource a couple of hours a week and seeing how this works, and being open to those kinds of things? Or I think this medication might be what's causing the problem here. I've worked with another child. This is what happened with this child. What can you do there? And then going to DSS sometimes and saying, y'all, this is just not a good placement for this kid wherever this child is. Let's try something else. And I think I would hope that most of us would be willing to.
Do you have in-class support as part of your special ed program?
Yeah, they do.
So when you talk about the resource teacher, is it usually in class rather than
The resource teachers actually has her own class. So they go in with the resource teacher. She may take 4 or 5 at a time, or she may take 1 or 2 at a time. They usually, depending on what level that class is in terms of special education, they usually have an instructional assistant in the classroom. So you could have, say, an ED class with 5 students, 1 teacher, and an instructional support person in that class with them. LD, which is the learning disabled, you may not have as much. Learning disabled kids typically have a very normal IQ. It's just that they learn in a different way. So they may be your kids that may have an auditory processing problem, or maybe dyslexic or something like that. So you may not have the same level of support, but depending on how many students you have in your class and the disability that the child has, you could have more than 1 instructional support person in that class. And they should, in theory, be working with the students on some individual activities while the teacher is doing some other things with her instruction. So it shouldn't be just, I'm standing in the back to look to see who's misbehaving. It should be more about working with the student and differentiating what they're doing. Students that don't fit under special ed, they also may be eligible for 504 accommodation plans. And those basically say that if a child has a health or mental health issue, or something that's causing that child a significant life, that they cannot do a significant life function, with an education being one, that they could be eligible for an accommodations plan. You can't have both. You either have one or the other. This is the one most people would prefer. But a lot of students may have a 504, and it could be, like I said, it could be on something like ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or it could be a child that's diabetic, it could be a child that has asthma. But if that condition prevents them from doing a major life function, then they are eligible for a 504 accommodations plan. What you do need to have is typically some documentation of what that condition is. So usually a doctor will present a note and say, you know, such and such has asthma, and at times they cannot do whatever. And then you would sit before a team, and the team would come up with whatever the accommodation is. I had a child that had narcolepsy, and that child, what we did with that particular child was to allow the child to come into school later in the day, because the medication that the child was on, believe it or not, it caused the child to fall asleep early in the morning. So we had to do some different things with classes. We have had children that have asthma that maybe can't do PE or have to have accommodations. Maybe they can't run the 6-minute mile. They may have to do a different type of, what do you call it, a different type of PE. So accommodations can be for lots of different conditions. It's not just physical things, it can be mental health things, but whatever it is, if the child cannot perform their daily living and it has a significant impact, then they can have an accommodations plan. The thing about the accommodations plan is that it may or may not be permanent, and it's just a matter of the team sitting down and looking at the evidence and then drawing up the plan. But it can be a lot of different things. I think of all the things that we've done with students over the years with that, and that may be the case with some of the students that you're working with. They're not special ed, but there's some other things going on that you request that the team consider that. There are lots of academic sort of services in the school district. We have all different types of schools that will meet some of the needs of our students. There are some high school students that just the traditional high school is not good. They want to go to the middle college that provides a job for them during the day, a laptop, computer, and they take classes from 12 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So that's definitely a different type of schedule for your high schooler. Lets them sleep in the morning. You know, they can work either in the evening or on the weekends or whatever, but they find a job for them so that they can work. And for a lot of students, based on what their household is like, as they get older, they may be contributing to supporting that household. And we know we have a significant number of teen parents and pregnant girls, so it just kind of depends. We've got services.
What is your basics? What is the basics?
I don't know what I was thinking actually when I wrote that, but it's probably, well, I guess the thought I had is that any student in our district is really eligible for the services. You know, we don't really close off things unless, you know, obviously by law you can't have special ed, but pretty much if you're in our district and there's a service, there's, you know, we're going to try and get you that service. We're not going to say, well, you know, you can't have, because we do provide a lot. We've talked about access for records. If you've got the court order, that's generally going to handle most of what you need. You may have some nurses that may need to get educated in certain areas. The biggest thing with nurses is that they're going to say is HIPAA. HIPAA says you can't, but if you got a court order that says medical records, the only thing that they would probably be hesitant upon is going to be your HIV infection, because there's some special laws around HIV. So if you got a student that's HIV, they may be really staunch and say no. But I've had, in fact, had a question, well, I had an incident to come up this morning where a social worker said, the nurse won't even give me this information and she wants me to go do this on a child. So I just had a conversation yesterday with the nurse coordinator and said, you know, you need to go talk back with your people, because they need to understand that unless it's HIV or a parent has expressly written, I don't want access to my child's medical records to be made to school staff, then those are the only times that we can withhold. You guys have a court order, so y'all are in good shape, because otherwise you would only have directory type of information.
What about access to faxing information?
To fax?
Just faxing information. Does HIPAA prohibit you faxing grades, attendance, behavior?
No, HIPAA is just the health piece. No, we can fax information. There's typically, a lot of times people will have on their fax that thing about confidentiality if anybody else receives it. No, we can fax information, and we fax it a lot, especially to family court, because we work a lot with family court, Department of Juvenile Justice, and other schools where we fax information back and forth when a child transfers. So we can fax that kind of information. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Think of anything else you guys have questions on. So I think that's pretty much covered that.